Hello and welcome to part 2 of the interview with Canadian chemical processes expert Paul Martin. In case you have missed it, in part 1, Paul talked us through the rather inconvenient facts about hydrogen as a means to export energy from Australia and why that is a rather far-fetched idea. Ultimately, no matter how much people hope that this will work, the export of hydrogen as a means of energy transport is rather hopeless. If you want to know more, please do listen to that episode. I heard that some people found the first episode rather technical, and yes, there's a fair bit of truth to that. And unfortunately, this second part is also, at least in parts, pretty jargony. But please don't let that put you off. Just listen to it and you will get the gist of it. So quickly, what are we going to be talking about in this second part? We're going to find out the best uses for hydrogen, how we will best decarbonize our lives. We'll learn about carbon taxes and how Canada has implemented them quite successfully. We hear objections to carbon taxes, what fuels we will be using for land transport in the future, also for air traffic and long-distance shipping, whether we will be able to use the existing gas infrastructure like terminals, pipelines, pumping stations, and so on. So please listen carefully. There's a lot of seriously good information coming your way. We start off after James asked Paul how hydrogen can play a role in the future. So here we go.
First of all, I'm not a hydrogen skeptic. I love hydrogen. I think hydrogen is far too valuable and useful as a molecule to be wasting it as a fuel. And the thing that Australia should be focusing on is not on exporting energy just because Australia is used to exporting energy. Australia has the unique set of conditions that make it possible to make a decarbonized production of materials and chemicals. The conditions are the following. It's only two. One of them is you have to have wind and sun, and they have to be anti-correlated in time. And there are places, particularly in Western Australia, but also to some extent in Southern Australia, where those conditions are met. And number two, you have to be a hellacious long way away from anybody that wants electricity, because otherwise you'll sell electricity, because that's the logical thing to do, right? So there are a lot of people talking about making hydrogen in places where it makes no sense to make hydrogen because they have only wind or only sun, and those projects will not make money because their capacity factors are too low in order to pay. But when you have wind and sun anti-correlated with one another, you get these high capacity factors, 70% plus. That gives you high capital utilization, which allows you to make an inexpensive product relative to what it would cost to make with just sun or just wind. Australia should really, if it's smart, and if the likes of Twiggy Forrest are thinking correctly and not in the hyperbole of energy export, Australia should be making direct reduced iron using hydrogen from iron ore that Australians already possess, so that you're shipping less mass and you're shipping something that embodies energy for use not as energy, but to avoid the need to make expensive energy locally in Germany, as an example. So you reduce iron ore to iron metal using hydrogen in Australia, you ship the direct reduced iron to Germany, they feed it into their existing electric arc furnace steel plants, and they make the steel. That makes logical sense. You make ammonia in Australia, not to waste it as a ship's fuel or to burn it in stupid Japanese coal-fired power plants, but to use it as fertilizer, which is its highest value use in terms of, usefulness to humankind. That's what we should be thinking about. And exporting energy, trying to figure out what the new LNG is, here's a hint. There is no new LNG. None. None of them work. Not ammonia, not methanol, not liquid organic hydrogen carriers, not compressed hydrogen, not liquefied hydrogen, not metal hydrides. None of that stuff is the LNG of the future. The LNG of the future is HVDC cables. That's it. So
HVDC being high voltage direct current.
That's right. I'm not saying that you're going to make HVDC cables and connect Australia to Singapore, although there are some people that are talking about things like that. I'm talking about, as an example, people in other parts of the world that are currently thinking, well, we import a lot of energy in the form of molecules. Let's just replicate that. We'll import molecules from Australia and our energy problems will go away. No, those people are going to have to make friends with their neighbors. They're going to have to make HVDC connections with their neighbors. They're going to have wider grids that run east-west as well as north-south. They're going to have to incorporate smart demand control with storage and with opportunistic curtailment and opportunistic uses. And they're also going to have some stored fuels. But the notion that you're going to store those fuels, you're going to make excess hydrogen in the summer and make fuels out of it and then store those for use in winter, that's one of many options. And it's probably the dumbest of them. There's already a 3,000 kilometer HVDC link to the tune of something like 10 gigawatts in China. These cables can be made bidirectional. They're expensive, but their losses are quite modest. If they're provided across distances that make a difference in terms of weather systems and timing in terms of sun or wind, they really can make a difference to how much storage you need. And storage is the thing that's expensive at the moment. And by the way, storage is getting cheaper too.
While we're at it, how much is a kilowatt hour of the grid in Canada?
If I buy electricity here between 11 p.m. and 7 a.m., which is the only time I ever charge my electric car, it costs me 2.8 Canadian cents per kilowatt hour plus 1.9 cents delivery. If I want to use electricity between 4 and 9 p.m. Monday through Friday, it costs me 28 cents per kilowatt hour plus 1.9 cents delivery. Yeah. So it depends greatly on time of day.
We pay way more for electricity here. Way more. Peak times 2 p.m. to 8 p.m., you are struggling to get under 50 cents Australian. The off-peak that they call, you're struggling to get under 12. So our electricity here is exceptionally expensive.
And the reason ours is cheap is that we built nuclear power plants, which are load inflexible, and we built them in the 1970s. Plus, we have all this run-of-river hydro that, once you've built the Weir Dam and you've installed the generators, you just run it flat out because any water that spills over the Weir is lost. There's no storage. Needless to say, you want to encourage people to use electricity at night. And by the way, this program of 2.8 cents per kilowatt hour, that's brand new. That only happened in May. To give you an idea, at that 2.4 cents plus 1.9 cents delivery, my Model Y is costing me 64 cents per 100 kilometers to drive.
Yeah.
Versus my Prius, which is costing me $7.50 for gasoline.
You don't have to convince me about the Teslas. I'm a huge fan.
The story I like to tell people about is my farm. We have a little farm east of Toronto, and we don't have any electrical connection there. We have just solar. And we have, panels are cheap. So we have all the panels that we need based on our winter demand. And then we have as much battery as we can afford. But even so, those batteries are pretty cheap. The batteries I bought are lithium iron phosphate batteries. And the last batch that we bought were under $90 per kilowatt hour, including delivery. And building a pack out of them costs $20 and takes half an hour. So those batteries with a 6,000 cycle guaranteed life, they return electricity to me for 2.5 US cents per kilowatt hour, plus whatever the electricity cost me in the first place. So the cost of storage is 2.5 cents plus whatever I want to pay myself in interest on my capital investment. Is that not cheap enough? Because if that's not cheap enough, I don't know what's going to be cheap enough for you.
I was just going to say, do you mind if I just jump in there? So,
go for it.
So I certainly don't have a huge amount of background in this area and in energy. And so this might be a bit of a silly question, but from a layman's perspective, when people talk about hydrogen, my basic understanding was that it was taking energy that it is in a form that is not able to be stored. So like you said, direct energy that's being generated through wind and solar, and putting it into a form of storage. So if it's not the solution for storage, like, are you talking about batteries alone when you talk about storage? Or what are the most efficient forms of storage?
Storage is batteries, it's pumped hydro, and it's heat storage. I'm working on two of those three. There's really no need for me to work on pumped hydro. It's pretty straightforward. And in fact, we built a giant pumped hydro project here because we had these nuclear power plants that we didn't want to shut off at night. Everybody says, oh, wind and solar, they're such a problem because they're not flexible to demand, right? They make power when they make power, and they don't make power when they don't make power. And it doesn't matter when we demand. If the two aren't matched, we're in trouble. Well, that's exactly the same problem that nuclear has. Nuclear makes power all the time. And the reason that it makes power all the time is that it has no fueling cost, and all of its other operating costs, like all those people that are running that nuclear power plant, you can't send them home if the plant's not generating power. It's inflexible to demand. What's the solution to demand inflexibility? It's storage. So the thing that's changed is that batteries used to be $3,000 a kilowatt hour, and now they're under $100. And with sodium ion, they're going under $20 in a decade, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Now, I can be wrong. I mean, predictions are hard, especially about the future, as Yogi Berra said. But, there's nothing in a sodium ion battery that isn't absolutely earth abundant. Cycle life consideration should be fantastic because the voltage is low. In a grid storage situation, energy density does not matter at all. And the thing that we won't do in a decarbonized future that makes economic sense is unnecessary transformations of thermodynamic work, so electricity and the like, to heat or proxies for heat, which are chemicals. Because doing so, thermodynamics frowns on it. It basically says, okay, well, you're going to have to pay a tremendous tithe in energy for doing that. And then I'm going to hit you again on the return journey. People go, you're obsessed with efficiencies. No, I'm obsessed with cost. I'm cheap. I don't want to pay too much. And I don't want, these crazy notions, for instance, these people who think that we'll be making ammonia from electricity that's made into hydrogen in Newfoundland and then shipping it to Germany to burn in German power plants. The way I describe those projects is buy 10 kilowatt hours in Newfoundland, get 1 or 2 back in Germany. Come on, the Germans are rich, but they're not that rich.
Well, people would argue we have the infrastructure, right? We already that's what the people say in the Alga talk. Oh, in Victoria we have a skilled workforce, and
we have the infrastructure.
Yeah.
I've written another article where I take this one apart. So the natural gas industry, you can imagine if you're a natural gas distributor, your choices are either to quietly go out of business and admit that all of your assets are liabilities in a decarbonized future and hope that you can sell your shares before your shareholders realize that that's the case. Or you say, I'm going to put a different gas in my lines and hence I have a future. And that's what the hydrogen thing's about. But when you look at it, the devil is in the details and he's not hiding. I mean, there are problems with the metallurgy. There are problems with the energetics. Every compressor would have to be replaced. Every end-use device would have to be replaced with a new one, not just simply rejetting like you would to change between natural gas and propane or the like. When you look at the details of this, oh my goodness, it's just awful. So the notion that you can reuse existing infrastructure is a sunk cost fallacy. You should expect the natural gas industry to be selling this idea. You should expect them to be disingenuous about it. They have a clear conflict of interest. You can't believe a word they're saying about any of this. Yeah, there is no reuse of the existing infrastructure.
So I think February last year, the first liquid hydrogen ship was actually shipped from Sydney, South Australia to Japan.
Yeah, and it caught fire.
What?
Yes, it caught fire.
That was big news. That it caught fire was not big news. But
that it caught fire was also big news. But yes, it caught fire. It didn't blow up and kill people. It just caught fire. And yes, you can do it. There are lots of things you can do. Hydrogen is actually used in the liquid form as a fuel for rockets, the upper stages of rockets. And even that application is questionable. It's really, as a transport fuel, hydrogen is just 100% a dead end.
So we can't just use the LNG ships?
No, of course not, because they're designed for a gas that is a boiling point 100 and something degrees warmer. You can't reuse the LNG terminals. The energy density of hydrogen is a quarter that of liquid natural gas. There's so many reasons that you just can't. So yeah, in a decarbonized future, LNG terminals have no use. You're not going to use them for ammonia. I'm sorry. You're just not going to. It's just not designed for it. It's not the right idea. And you're sure not going to use it for liquid hydrogen. That's absurd.
So if I understand you correctly, so there is a big use for hydrogen. It's just the transport that's the problem.
Well, we make 120 million tons of hydrogen a year in the world. We just make all of it from fossils without carbon capture. Hydrogen has more emissions, a greater emission profile than the entire aviation industry right now. And yet, and instead of solving that problem, the problem of hydrogen related emissions, we're dreaming about some fantasy future decades from now where we make an excess of hydrogen and we can afford to waste it in low efficiency applications like home heating or transport or making electricity out of it again. And you can tell that that's disingenuous. It does not make sense. It doesn't make energetic sense. It doesn't make economic sense. It's not practical. The only way that you can push the decarbonization of hydrogen itself is with carbon taxes or emission bans. And that's not happening right now. We're not making green ammonia in the world to use as fertilizer because we know that farmers will not pay for it because in order to do so, they would have to make food more expensive. So what do? You just carbon tax everything that has carbon emissions associated with it, including fertilizer. That will make food more expensive, but that's okay. It'll also motivate farmers to be more economical with the way that they use ammonia and nitrates and urea and nitrogen fertilizers that are made from ammonia. And it'll allow us to decarbonize those things. And it'll also make them cautious about tractor fuel and probably push them to running electric equipment eventually. They'll be able to make their own electricity, charge their own batteries, and I'm confident we'll see a transformation in transport, in farming, in mining, in all kinds of industry when we finally get around to the inevitable notion that emissions to the atmosphere must have a cost if we wish to avoid them. The only way we're going to transition is if the new thing that doesn't have emissions is cheaper than the old thing that did have emissions. That kind of decarbonization journey will still happen. It'll just take a century. And the climate will be destroyed in the meantime. And my kids will be in big trouble and their kids in even worse. So I really hope that we do get serious. I mean, we're trying our best in Canada. We do have a carbon tax. It's headed to 170 Canadian dollars a ton, but only if the current government stays in power.
We have an interesting scenario here in Australia, aside from COVID, but there was only one brief period when greenhouse gas emissions were reduced on an annual basis in Australia. That was a brief period when we had a carbon tax.
Yep.
And that Prime Minister, James, was it Gillard? Who was it?
Gillard.
Gillard.
Yeah, Julie Gillard.
She introduced the carbon tax, and the voters never had a chance to vote on that because she comes in a coup. The carbon tax within months was axed, and so was that prime minister.
Yeah, and you know what? We were told the exact same thing in Canada. We were told we would never have a carbon tax because the Americans will never have one. And guess what? We have a carbon tax. It's broadly publicly supported, and it survived 2 elections and a Supreme Court challenge. So there's a lot of people out there who are betting a lot of money on telling you that there will never be a carbon tax anywhere. And every serious economist who has looked at this issue agrees that if you want to reduce the amount of illicit waste disposal, as an example, you need to put a price on waste disposal that's durable, and you have to make sure that people can't illegally dump stuff over the neighbor's fence and get away with it. And that's what we're doing with GHG emissions. We're dumping them over the neighbor's fence and getting away with it. And until that gets fixed, you will not have decarbonization because you're not serious. You're not willing to pay for it. It's like, oh yeah, well, we'll take it if it's free, right? Or if it's cheaper. Electric cars, LED lighting, yeah, we'll take those. Heat pumps, maybe. Rooftop solar and storage in Australia, okay, fine. But forget about doing the hard thing like decarbonizing heating in Canada. That would be hard. And the reason that the Canadian carbon tax is so well supported is that the generally conservative people who object to taxes of all kinds hate the carbon tax. And the excuse that they use for hating the carbon tax is that it's either inflationary or it punishes the poor, right? It makes food and heat and so on harder for poor people. So we fix that problem by making the tax revenue neutral. So what we do is we take all the money, we put it in a pile. We take 10% and we use 10% of that money to decarbonize public infrastructure and to pay for the tax. And the remaining 90%, we just divide it by the number of people that pay tax, and we give everybody a check. And they call that the dividend. And it's extremely well supported because people that are truly poor, they don't drive cars. They walk and they take public transit, and they live in socialized multi-unit public housing. So their emissions are extremely low. They get way more money back than they pay in extra tax.
We had the same exact system here that was tax neutral, and I don't think many people actually realized that.
Oh, yeah, we have the same problem. We have a lot of rich people here who don't even notice that they get this dividend check, and they go, oh, I don't get any money. Because, of course, it's done by direct deposit, right? The same way that your taxes get paid.
Yeah, or a reduction of what, comes out of your pay pack each week.
Yeah, or whatever it is. In our case, they do actually give you a remittance, and it shows up in your bank account. But a lot of rich people don't notice. In the end, you get this is hard on poor people. And it's not. It's just not. But
Axe the tax was the exact slogan that was used in Australia. So I think some people over there have been looking at what worked over here, to be honest, as to how they...
Yeah, of course.
Paul, how do we decarbonize?
How will we decarbonize? I have a nice article called "What Are the Energy Options?" or what are the energy alternatives? And I've laid it out for you. We're going to electrify everything that we can. And what we can't electrify, we're going to try harder to electrify. A lot of the nonsense that you hear out there, heavy industry can't electrify. I'm sorry, but I designed and built pilot plants for 26 years. And of the dozens of projects I was involved in, only one of them used fire for heat ever. All the others used electric. But we'll also need some storage, not a month's worth, but a reasonable amount. So we're going to need wider grids. We're going to overbuild renewables. We're going to build 2 and 3 times as much electrical generation capacity as we need in the summer. And we will have demand response. We'll have, the example I use is the clothes dryer. Right now I push the clothes dryer, tell it to start, and it starts. In the future, I'll push the start button on the clothes dryer, and it'll say, I'm going to start at 11:01 p.m. when electricity gets cheaper. Unless you push the start button again, then I'll start now. So there'll be a lot of, that's exactly the same way that the app works on my phone for charging my Tesla. I tell it, I want to charge using off-peak electricity, and it works it out. It has the car charged to whatever percentage I want by that time in the morning that I want to leave, or when the off-peak period ends. And I don't even have to think about it. I don't wake up in the middle of the night and check. It just does it. That's how we'll decarbonize. And we won't do it without carbon taxes or emission bans. It has to cost money to emit stuff from burning fossils for energy. And if it doesn't, we will burn fossils for energy because it's a way to make money.
Air traffic as a problem.
Nope, not a problem. There are 2 things that need liquid fuels, and that's long-distance aviation and long-distance shipping. That's it. They together don't represent a very large percentage of our energy mix. And we can do those easily with biofuels if we want. Now, it'll be more expensive. So somebody's got to be able to pay for it, which means that the fossil alternatives have to cost more. Otherwise, shipping and aviation will continue to burn fossils. And honestly, maybe that's the right thing to do. We don't worry so much about shipping and aviation in the short term. Instead, we work on electrifying land transport where it actually saves people money to use an electric vehicle, you see? So this ridiculous focus on hard to decarbonize sectors, that's also a predatory delay strategy. It's basically saying, well, we can't get to 99%. The last 2 or 3 or 4 or 5% are hard. It's like, well, let's get to 95% and then worry about it. We can use regulation to trim the last 5% if we need to. We can just say, look, you're not allowed to burn that stuff anymore. Don't do it. It's not allowed. That's what we did with leaded gasoline, by the way. Yeah. Making unleaded gasoline is much more expensive than making leaded gasoline. But we banned it because we decided that we didn't want to give kids brain damage anymore. Lowering the IQ of the entire population by 5 points, that was too much. We decided we weren't going to do it anymore. What we didn't do is hang a sign on the pump and sell the leaded gasoline for 20% cheaper, but put a sign on it that said, don't buy this because it'll give your kids brain damage. Because we know what people would do. They would feel bad and they would buy the leaded gasoline. And they'd make excuses. Well, my kid's smart enough, or yeah, it's going to hurt other people's kids, not mine. We would find an excuse. And that's why we didn't do that. We banned it. And so at a certain point, we're going to have to ban certain things. But yeah, shipping and aviation will be biofueled. There's more than enough biomass capacity to do that. We might have to augment that with a little bit of hydrogen because they're all hydrogen deficient, but not e-fuels, not taking CO2 and water and electricity and trying to undo combustion, and produce fuels. That's the same energetic madness as trying to ship hydrogen from Australia to Germany or to Korea or the like.
We have to.
Yeah, it has. And I've got somewhere to go too, but we could talk about this for 10 hours.
I just want to get one of my rants in. The whole thing with green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, and gray hydrogen already showed me that there is a marketing campaign going on here. So green hydrogen we can all agree on is green, right? So it's renewable. I'm talking about the terminology here. So green is green.
It's all
right?
euphemism. Yeah.
So someone comes along and says, okay, the one in Victoria where they want to burn coal to create hydrogen and then ship it. That's not called black hydrogen. That's oddly enough called gray hydrogen, right? Exactly.
Yeah. Well, actually, the terminology varies. It depends on how heavy a euphemism you want to use. So let's say that you were going to make hydrogen the way that most hydrogen in the world is made. You react methane, fossil methane with steam at high temperature and you make CO2 and you make hydrogen. That process is referred to as gray hydrogen, but in fact, it's 30% more emissive in CO2 emissions and even more so in CO2e emissions than if you were just to burn gas to begin with. So it's actually blacker than black, if you will, and people call it gray. And then when they talk about coal gasification like they do in China or they're trying to do in South Australia or wherever, they call it brown or black hydrogen. But of course, then they want to capture and store the CO2, and that becomes blue. But of course, I don't call that blue. I call it bruise-colored hydrogen because it's blackish blue, right? And I know a lot about that because I've looked in detail at the biggest blue hydrogen project in the world, which happens to be in Alberta. It's called Quest. And for an enormous amount of money, it captures very little CO2. It does do it. It puts away 1 million tons of CO2 a year, but at a cost of 145 Canadian dollars per ton, all of which is paid for by taxpayers. Otherwise, nobody would do it. The problem with this blue hydrogen business is that the blacker it is, the higher its emissions, the more money you make if you get away with calling it blue. Blue hydrogen is a Hail Mary on the part of the fossil fuel industry, hoping to stay relevant in a decarbonized future. And one last thing I always add at the end of these talks, in the course of this discussion, I've made a lot of assertions that, sound like I'm just saying black is white or whatever I'm saying. And they're assertions of opinion as if they were fact. Now, those opinions are defended in my writings, and I encourage people to not just accept my opinion. Go to spitfireresearch.com or go to my LinkedIn profile and read my articles where I've spelled out why I think the things that I do and how my analysis has come to the conclusions that I've come to, and debate or discuss with me there. And I would be happy if people would be able to, with fact, change my mind.
For sure, Paul. We'll put a link to that in our show notes.
Please do. I don't make any money from any of it. It's all just there to inform. And I also co-founded an organization called the Hydrogen Science Coalition. So if you go to h2sciencecoalition.com, you'll find lots of resources that are very pretty and very well organized. We have some help with that, and that really helps us get the point across.
Thank you, Paul, for agreeing to come on. I had such a good time.
Okay, well, yeah, you know what? If you think of more things to talk about, we can do it again.
Can't wait. Thank you so much. Good luck with your friends and everything else you're doing.
All right. Cheers.
Thanks, mate.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
What do you think of his record of him?
So I found it extremely interesting. I thought his work was really just around hydrogen, but it's about so much more than that. And he has this really good macro level view about the energy future for not just Canada, but for everywhere. So I found that very interesting.
That Alga talk he gave was phenomenal. It showed exactly the discrepancy between the hope that everybody has and the PR that goes around it.
That was obviously a highly politicized talk, that one. And the spin sounds good, but from what Paul is saying, when you actually get into the detail, it just simply doesn't add up. And like to a layman like me, when we talk about like repurposing existing LNG infrastructure, for example, someone like me thinks, well, sure, okay, it's, you can liquefy hydrogen. It sounds reasonable. Like, yeah, we can repurpose the LNG network to transport hydrogen instead. One's a liquid, the other's a liquid, but it just doesn't work that way. And,
no.
And people, no. I didn't even know that. I didn't know how hard it was to actually repurpose it. And the properties that are different between natural gas and hydrogen, and the difficulties that creates.
We didn't mention it, but one of the things, and we must mention that here now, is that to liquefy LNG, so methane, in other words, it goes down to minus 160 degrees Celsius. Okay, that's already damn cold.
Pretty damn cold.
If you want to ship that, you need to keep it that cold. Otherwise, it ain't going to be liquid anymore.
Yeah.
But we seem to have that under control. Have a guess how cold hydrogen has to be liquefied. Oh. Don't worry, you can't get it. Minus 250.
Wow. Absolute zero is what? Minus 273 or something?
That's right. So absolute zero, which you can't get to, zero. No matter how hard you try, right? He's at 273. You can't get there. Unreal. We are now talking 23 degrees Kelvin or minus 250 degrees Celsius this is how you're proposing to ship hydrogen to Japan, really? With a bleed-off factor of bleeding, you lose hydrogen at about a rate of 0.2 to 1% a day. Wow. That's why he called it hopium. I was hoping I would get to talk to him about this, but this was the beauty, right? So there is the lady from Victoria, and then the CEO of a company that turns coal into hydrogen and uses the existing infrastructure to export it. And then Paul comes in and he railroads. I mean, he was very, very polite. He held back a lot. They're glad it wasn't me talking there, because Paul was very diplomatic. But I loved his talk, and that's how I came across him, and I thought we need to talk to him.
Yeah, for sure. No, he was great.